watching the whole Zoom. And our second presenter will be coming in on Zoom from Phoenix, Arizona today. So you're watching the presentation up here, both our initial speaker and the second speaker. So welcome to this joint meeting of SABR in Chicago, which I have been a SABR member myself for over 40 years. So it's exciting for me to have SABR here. And then we have the Del Webb Skybox Sports Group, which we have formed here at Del Webb. I'm a resident here. We have formed it about 7 months ago, and we meet every week. And we are really excited to have this special meeting today of the joint groups. So thanks for coming. Thanks for registering, and we may have more people joining us in progress. So the agenda is going to be, we'll have Doug Kurkul do his presentation on his new book. It's a Beautiful Day for Baseball, the National Pastime in the 1960s, which happens to be my baseball life start because I was a kid in St. Louis in 1961, and that's when I started to become a baseball fan, obviously, with the Cardinals in the 60s. It was a great time. Then when you finish, Doug, we'll take a 5-minute break for restrooms, which are right outside here, right outside this door if you need to go out, and coffee, which is back in the hallway. You can refresh. And we also have some donut holes if you need something with the coffee. And then when we come back after the short break, we will move to Phoenix, and we will have Bret McKeand, who is the president of the Del Webb Museum. And he will be talking about Del Webb's life and times, including his time as a developer and construction company owner, as well as owner of the Yankees. So with that, I hope you enjoy this today. And we will now turn it over to Doug Kurkul. And Doug, thanks so much for coming out here today.
Great to see everybody. Do I need to use the microphone or do you hear me okay? All right, sounds good. Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be able to speak to the SABR audience. I've been a SABR member myself back in the days when I lived in the Washington, D.C. area, Bob David's chapter, and then when I lived in Texas, now here in Illinois. It's great to see you all here, and man, this is a beautiful community as well. Great place to be on a Saturday morning. So back in 1967, during the month of August, there was a 7-year-old kid in Cleveland area, and his parents took a 3-week trip to Europe. The kid was an only child, and he was left with his grandparents. The grandfather was a big baseball fan, and through the streets of Cleveland, we would go for walks. Obviously, I was the 7-year-old kid. My grandfather and I would go for walks, and I was astounded. I would see kids playing baseball everywhere, and then we would see on the front porches, most of the houses didn't have air conditioning back then. People would be sitting on the front porch, drinking a Stroh's, drinking a Bud, and listening to the Cleveland Indians. Now, the Indians weren't in contention. I mean, they were an 8th place team that year. But
would you mind standing in front of the laptop?
Sure.
Because we are streaming this.
There you go. Sure. So back in the 60s, baseball was still the undisputed national pastime, and you would see it, people playing it, you would see it, people listening to it, watching it, going to the games. You even had people like Bruce Springsteen as a young kid playing in an organized baseball league. And that era, as Bob was just explaining, really left its mark on a lot of us. By the time my parents got back from Europe 3 weeks later, 2 things had happened. One was I had completely overextended my welcome with my grandparents. They were happy to get rid of me. But the other thing was, thanks to my grandfather, I had become a lifelong baseball fan. And I bet almost everybody in this room has a story like that, how you got interested in our great national pastime. Yeah, it's not, let me see if it'll. 2014. It hit the top 25 on Amazon's baseball history list, as did this particular book. This one also got named #2 hot new release by Amazon, which was kind of neat to see, and #1 release for sports for teenagers and young adults. I didn't even know that was a category, but you know, when you publish a book, you'll take the accolades as we go forward. Bill, I think I'm frozen again.
I'm getting my exercise. I had kicked over to.
Okay, there you go. Here's a list of the ball players that I interviewed either by telephone, in person. More recently, some of them were by email or by US mail. What I found was in the early years, a lot of the players were very comfortable doing it by telephone. And then in the more recently, some of the ball players said, you know, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing and talking on the phone. And with that in mind, some of them wound up having great exchanges of information by email or by US mail. The 1960s as an era, not a single player told me that the players then were better. Not a single player told me that they had more talent than today's players. But what they did tell me over and over again, including these fellas, is that the game was played better in that era, that the players knew the game, that they knew how to play the fundamentals, and that because the focus was on just getting the games executed quickly, that they really had a higher standard of baseball, and that there was more action in the games than there is today. So when I talk to young people, I have to spend even more time on this next topic, which is just how different the game of baseball was in the 1960s compared to today, because the young people, they really don't have any way of knowing what it was like in the era when some of us were growing up. So think about now, the lowest paid baseball player makes $740,000 a year. Back then, the compensation was relatively modest. The people sitting in the grandstands, their salaries were not that much different than a lot of the players. Now, sure, you had Frank Robinson, Mickey Mantle, Koufax, and Drysdale, guys that were making six figures or close to it. But a lot of the ball players were making, you know, 14, 15, 20,000. And in those days, that was a decent salary, but it was not anything that you could live year round on. And in the book, there's a lot of examples of what ball players did during the winter, whether it was selling sporting goods or stockbroker work, whatever it was that they had to do to make additional income. Today, you got the constant player movement back and forth from the minor leagues, major leagues, disabled lists. Back then, and of course, trades. Back then, there was relatively little player movement, and that allowed the local fan base to really get to know and have an affinity for their players. Pitchers, obviously, going deep into games. Nowadays, you know, 6 innings and 3 runs is called a quality start, and you rarely even see the starter go 6 innings now. Back in those days, as Bob Gibson said, a quality start was to go the distance and get a W. I think another huge difference is that we now have 12 teams going into the postseason. Until '69, it was just 2 teams. And so you knew you had the best team in each league going into the postseason. Starting in '69, it was still really tough to get in, but you did have the East and the West divisions. And so you had 4 teams going in. Nowadays, the World Series can run into November, you know, when you've got frost on the leftover pumpkins, you know, football season is half over. The other sports are starting too. But back in those days, usually by about October 12th, you know, by now the World Series would be completed. And with only 2 teams going in, it was just so amazing to have the entire country focused on those two teams in the World Series. Now it's just a little bit harder. I mean, it's still not, take nothing away from the great game of baseball, but it's just a little harder for the country as a whole to get wound up in it. Beat writers until the 1990s used to travel with the team. And what that meant was they were around the players a lot of hours every week, and they really knew what was going on. They had relationships with the players, and they had to exercise discretion about what they would write about and what they wouldn't cover. Now, you know, there's kind of a separation of church and state there, and the journalists no longer travel with them. Infield practice daily in those days. And so you would have, you know, Don Kessinger and Glenn Beckert turning the double play. Not only would they spend hours during spring training on it, but then they would refresh those skills every single day. You don't see infield practice very often anymore in Major League Baseball. The minor leagues, there were more minor leagues, there were more minor league teams. That meant more citizens, more cities were able to enjoy minor league baseball in those days. And they were all independently run. It wasn't until 2022 that Major League Baseball centralized it all in New York City, kind of a hostile takeover, according to my friend Branch Rickey. Then statistics. I don't know, how many of you are a big fan of the new statistics? So about half and half. I think that the new statistics are just wonderful, but the fact is, for decades, baseball got by on, you know, a limited set of statistics, and they weren't all that accessible. You know, Don Locke, the outfielder for the Yankees and the Phillies and the Red Sox, said the only way you even knew what was going on in baseball was on Sunday morning. You would pick up a newspaper, and before you sat down for breakfast, you'd go to the sports section, and they would run all the league leaders in batting average and the other categories, and you would see that. Leon Wagner, who was a slugging outfielder for the Angels and the Indians, later for the White Sox and the Reds, he said he actually got his motivation by seeing his name among the league leaders whenever he was able to check a newspaper. You did have the sporting news back then. Only the most avid of fans would see that. You know, there might be a copy of it in the clubhouse. Of course, the general managers would have a copy of it for sure, as would a lot of other people who made their living in the management of baseball. Fewer teams then, more teams now. We have 750 roster spots. But with all the juggling of rosters now, well over 1,100 or so players will you know, appear in the major leagues. And that's another significant change. Back then, it was really challenging, particularly when you only had 8 teams in each league. It was really competitive to get a major league job and then try to hold on to it. Not that it's not super competitive now, just the numbers were a little different. Strikeouts, more strikeouts in today's game. Because there are so many more strikeouts now, of course, we have less action on the field. The game's much faster in the 60s. Major League Baseball has taken steps, as most of you know, to speed up the game, and I think they've been pretty well received, but that's just the last couple years. Pitching inside to the hitters, going hard into second base, crashing into fences to try to make a catch. You still see that, but not as frequently as it was back in the 60s. More brother combinations, lots of brother combinations that we still remember today, right? The Necro brothers, the Boyer brothers, Gaylord and Jim Perry, and so forth. And then the stars just being so well known. Sudden Sam McDowell, about 3 years ago, released a great baseball book. And he said, at the time he wrote it, he said, the biggest star in baseball is Mike Trout. He said, Mike Trout could walk down just about any city in America and go unrecognized. He said, could you imagine, you know, Mickey Mantle or Willie Mays in the 1960s walking down a street in any city in the country and not being mobbed? The baseball players were just more famous in our culture back then than they are now. So some of you, this being a SABR audience, some of you really love statistics, and I'm not going to go overboard, but I do want to share some with you that you may enjoy. Look at the difference in strikeouts. In 1965, the average team striking out in the National League 965 times. By 2021, about a 50% increase in strikeouts. That's a big change in the game. That also carried over to the World Series. In the 1960, one of the most famous World Series, only 9.4, that's both teams combined per game, 9.4 strikeouts. The year of the pitcher, 1968, by then it had already risen to 14 combined. But in the 2022 World Series, 21, more than 21 strikeouts. That's a lot of whiffing. And another area here is the area of sacrifice bunts. Now, we've seen a few sacrifice bunts here during the postseason if you've been watching the games, and it's kind of neat to see. But look at the distinction here. In the American League 1963, the average team dropped 71 and a half successful sacrifice bunts. In 2021, I mean, it basically was only happening about once every 11 games, 15 for the whole season. Just another really stark difference. The 2024 leaders this year, there's a player with Kansas City who had 8, that led the American League. And I know we have a Cardinals fan or two here. Michael Ciani, if I'm saying his name right, had 11, that led the National League. Whereas in 1965, you know, your league leaders were Fregosi and Parker with significantly more. Which league was better? How many of you would say that in the 1960s, the National League was better? A lot of hands. Does anybody think the American League was stronger? I don't see any hands. So I think you're probably right. Most of the evidence points to the National League. World Series, the NL took 6 out of 10. All-Star games, they took 9 out of 10. Diversity or balance, you had 6 teams winning the pennant in the NL, 5 in the American League. Now, the Yankees won it 5 years in a row at the beginning of the decade, and then it was open season for other teams to compete for it from 65 to 69. This is kind of an interesting stat, make of it what you will, but the ERA champions in the 1960s, 9 of the winner years are in the Hall of Fame. The only one who didn't make it was Mike McCormick, who won the ERA title in 1960 with the Giants. American League, none of them have made the Hall of Fame. So here are the guys that were the ERA leaders. Frank Baumann for the White Sox. Does anybody remember anything interesting about Frank Baumann? He was a big guy. I mean, by the time he was in junior high, he was already as big as most adults. But he is credited with being the first guy who actually used an agent to negotiate his first contract, you know, when he signed initially. Dick Donovan, 1961 with the Senators, was the ERA champion. And then in 1962, he became a 20-game winner after they traded him to Cleveland. Hank Aguirre, then Gary Peters a couple of times won it. Dean Chance in 1964, they were still only giving 1 Cy Young Award back then. And Juan Marichal will always tell people that, yeah, the reason I didn't win the Cy Young Award in 1964 was because Dean Chance had such an amazing year in the American League. Had there been 2 awards, Marichal almost certainly would have won it in the NL. Then the ERA champions for the rest of the decade, again, Peters and Horland. You just had such great pitching for the White Sox then. Tiant in 68, we just lost Louis, one of the real great personalities in the game. And Dick Bosman, who won it in 1969. Dick Bosman gives a lot of credit to his 1969 manager, Ted Williams. And why is that? Because Williams just instilled so much confidence in him. Williams told him he could easily be the best pitcher in the American League, and that's what turned out to happen that year. Then Bosman was engaged to get married after the season, and Williams was kidding him mercilessly, saying, man, you're going to gain 20 pounds eating your wife's cooking. You're going to gain a lot of weight. Well, he was using psychology there too, because he was challenging Bosman to come back in just as good a shape. And Dick did come back and he won 16 games the next year as well. So again, you know, accomplished pitchers, but interesting that none of these guys made the Hall of Fame. How about no hitters? So in the 1960s, there was an average of 3.5 no hitters per game. In 2021, there were actually 9 in the entire season. So for a while, it looked like Major League Baseball was getting an awful lot of no hitters. But now in 2024, I think there were only 4 or 5. So maybe we're, you know, kind of reverting to the mean in terms of the historical norm there. Now we see more no hitters where there's actually more than one pitcher, you know, who, because it was not a complete game. This was a slide that I showed to my Florida audience recently, just showing some of the ball players that were living in Florida year round back in the 1960s. Here's a partial list of guys in Illinois. And a lot of these, for those of you, you know, who were Chicago fans, Cubs or White Sox back in the day, you'll recognize some of these names. What surprised me is some of the names that are not on here. I thought that Randy Hundley would have already lived here year round because he's such a big part of the community now, but he actually didn't move to Chicago full time until the 1970s. Ken Holtzman was still living in Missouri. He did eventually live here part of the year full time. I'm sorry, for part of his life full time, but it wasn't until the 1970s. Obviously, some of these folks, though, very big names in baseball. And Dave Nicholson living in Roselle, Cal Neiman in East St. Louis, but a lot of these fellas were in the Chicago suburbs or in Chicago proper. Bill Tuttle in Farmington. And does anybody remember anything special about Bill Tuttle?
Largest jaw.
Right.
In baseball.
Yeah, because of his chewing tobacco habit, he wound up losing part of his jaw. And he wound up going around and educating younger ball players, telling them, hey, don't use chewing tobacco because you could end up just like me. Back in the 1960s, chewing tobacco was a huge part of the baseball culture. Beer was a huge part of the baseball culture. And back then, you didn't have the year-round focus on conditioning that you have now. So ball players would tend to get out of shape during the winter. And spring training really was a lot more about getting into game shape than it is these days. So I did some research on baseball gloves, some original research. I was interested in which of the manufacturers that each player used. What I learned was that most of the players actually signed a contract as soon as they went pro, long before they became major leaguers. They would sign usually with either Rawlings, Wilson, Spalding, or McGregor, and they would get 2 new gloves a year. They would also get 1 or 2 pair of baseball shoes per year. And in exchange, the company could use their name for endorsement rights. Now, if the team wanted, or rather, if Rawlings wanted to put Jim Cott's autograph on a baseball glove, that would be a different contract with a different set of royalties. But in terms of just normal endorsements, their ability, to put an ad in the Sporting News and, to say Joe Adcock or Ernie Banks uses our product, they were able to do that for the player's entire career. Some of the players would switch gloves. In fact, Ron Hansen, who we were just talking about, when he did the unassisted triple play, later that night, when he got back to the hotel, McGregor's representative called him and said, man, we are going to do a huge publicity promo on this. And sheepishly, Ron Hansen said, you know what, I got to tell you, I was using a Wilson glove tonight. And so, he was honest. And what wound up happening is there was just a lost opportunity there for some publicity. Rawlings had a guy that was named Harry Latina. known as the glove doctor. And between him and his son, they had a lot of patents on new developments for baseball gloves. Rawlings also had the stroke of genius to sponsor the Gold Glove Award and the Silver Glove for the minor leaguers. And that, of course, has turned out to be great branding. They still are using it all these years later. In the appendix of the book, there's a list of about 350 players and which gloves they were known to either endorse or use. And by my count, 38% were using Rawlings. Wilson and Spalding, kind of close in second place there. McGregor still had some big name players. McGregor seemed to have a lot of the people that were signing out of Kentucky or signing out of Cincinnati. So you had guys like Pete Rose, who grew up in Cincinnati, Claude Osteen, who was spending his summers in Cincinnati. A lot of those guys, McGregor was getting to them first, but they weren't as aggressive nationwide. And then you'll just see other names, occasionally like Sonnet or others, and they're mentioned in the book as well. But they were kind of bit players in the baseball glove market. Another topic that's of interest to me is baseball and faith. And, you think about back in those days, there was so much less support for a ball player if he was having any kind of emotional issues or other kinds of problems. These days, you've got performance coaches and there are sports psychologists available. There's the baseball chapel and so forth. None of that existed in the 60s. And really, if a ball player, let's say a ball player had a real drinking problem, usually nobody would say anything to him about it unless it got to the point where it was really starting to affect his play. Otherwise, they just didn't worry about it. There were players who were Catholic and made sure that they were going to church every Sunday. There were, maybe a dozen devout born-again Christians, not enough to really have much of a unified presence. Although Joe Moeller and Don Sutton and Jeff Torberg were teammates with the Dodgers, and those three, made sure that they were having a chapel on Sunday mornings. A smaller number of players with the Jewish faith, and for some of them, like Koufax, that was important to observe the Jewish holidays and so forth. So let's talk about a handful of players from the era, but I want to leave time for some dialogue because that can be the most fun part of any presentation. George Altman, some of you may remember him. He was a pretty good outfielder, a good hitter for the Cubs and several other clubs. Altman also played in Japan for, I believe, 6 years. He was the first guy to qualify for a big league pension in the United States and in Japan. In the book, I talk about some of the things that Altman said that were just so much different about baseball in the 60s in Japan compared to and in the 70s too, compared to in the United States. One thing he said was that the money was actually pretty darn good, but his wife hated it over there. And, for him to spend 6 years there with her, quite a sacrifice there. Here's a great picture of Ernie Banks along with Ron Santo. You guys know a lot about these two fellas. The only thing I'll add is that Banks was authentic in the Let's Play 2, authentic, as some of his teammates say in the book, about being Mr. Cub, Mr. Sunshine. And yet there was another side to him that Ken Holtzman and others talk about. And that was the side where he was kind of somber. That was the side of him where he was married and divorced 4 times during the course of his life. That was the side of him where they would play the home games during the day, and in the evenings, he would just go into the backyard, and his wife and kids knew to leave him alone, and he would hang out there in the backyard. And yet he was outgoing enough that he ran for city council, for alderman. So, he was just a study in contrast, and just an authentic guy who probably, as much as the Cubs fans loved him, the Cubs organization probably didn't treat him as well as they should have. particularly when DeRocher got there. And Leo insisted on being, kind of the number one. Duke Sims, born in the state of, I believe, Nevada, and then grew up in Pocatello, Idaho. Not what you would think of as the normal path to the big leagues. He was hoping to sign a big league contract. He was working a job in the mornings, cutting sheet metal, getting his hands all cut up, and then trying to play baseball in amateur leagues, in the evenings. It was kind of difficult for him. He's a catcher. There was a famous Yankees scout who was supposed to come and sign him. He didn't show up, and Duke's mom said, okay, you're never going to sign with the Yankees. Finally, it was the Indians that put the most money on the table. He signed with the Indians. There's some stories in the book about how he was just such a clever guy. One of them, he outsmarted Eddie Stanky, the manager of the White Sox, on a baseball rules matter in the course of a game. Also a ladies' man. He was good looking. He was constantly, entertaining ladies. He liked, admittedly, to drink a lot of alcohol. He and Sam McDowell would hang out. So some good stories there about Duke Sims. So Brooks Robinson, and of course, here he is with Frank. He was already a superstar when Frank got there to Baltimore in 1966. Brooks had been the MVP in 1964. That was kind of the year of the third baseman. He and Ken Boyer were the MVP award winners. But they had not won a pennant yet. And so when Frank Robinson came over from the Reds, everybody knew Robinson was going to help attendance. He was going to help score more runs. But what they didn't know is, how are these two guys going to get along? Well, they got along great for the 6 years that Frank was there. And Brooks would make a conscious effort to almost every night let Frank know, here's where I'm going for drinks. Here's where me and a couple of guys are going to go for dinner. Didn't mean Frank would go every night, but he would go 2 or 3 times a week with Brooks. And that was so different because Frank's experience with the Reds was that all the white players would go hang out by themselves, and the black players, basically Veda Pinson, Tommy Harper, and Frank, maybe sometimes Pete Rose would cross over and hang out with them, but it was racially very divided there. And these two guys made sure there were no divisions at all. Brooks bought a row house, and like a lot of the Orioles players, he lived right in the neighborhood with the fans. Finally, when they started having kids, he and his wife moved out to Lutherville, where they could have a little bit more space. He sold his row house to Dave McNally, the 20-game winning pitcher. After a while, Dave got married, he had kids, and he moved out to Lutherville as well. That was kind of the pattern back then. But part of the reason there was such an affinity at Memorial Stadium, the fans loving those Orioles players, is because a lot of them lived right there in the neighborhood. Bob Aspromonte, another brother combination. His older brother, Ken, was a ball player and then also a baseball manager. Some neat stories about Bob Aspromonte, kind of heartwarming stories in the book. I won't spoil the story there. So here's a couple of pictures of Stan Williams. Does anybody remember Stan Williams? A few of you do. He was a pitcher, came up with the Dodgers, and Stan Williams told me that when he signed, he didn't even know what a brushback pitch was, let alone a knockdown pitch. He said, the Dodgers taught me well, but he said that was how baseball was played back then. The reason I picked these two pictures, one is with the 1970 baseball card there, you can tell Stan Williams was a jokester. He was a guy that was always playing practical jokes. He always had some funny story to tell or kidding people. Another thing about Stan Williams was the serious side. His arm got so bad after he was traded to the Yankees actually gave up on him. And he was traded to Cleveland for almost nothing. He was in the minor leagues for 2 or 3 years. And the reporters would ask him about other players. They wouldn't even ask Stan because they figured Stan was washed up. So Williams one summer decided to take a 10-pound weight and just start rotating his arm back and forth like a helicopter and doing it for 15 or 20 minutes at a time, and then do it again the next day, do it again the next day. At the same time, he was wearing a rubber suit, getting himself into great shape. One day he's doing that rotation, boom, he feels the biggest pain he's ever felt in his life, but he had broken the adhesions that were keeping him from throwing hard. And after that, he came back. And if you look at his stats in 67, 68, 70 with Cleveland and the Twins, he had a nice second half of his career. This picture on the right shows Stan Williams as an elderly guy. I don't know if this is his garage or what. He lived for like 50 years in the same house with a swimming pool in California in the back, but a small house. And you can see that he had his work tools, very well organized. And then right next to it, all of his baseball photos. The reason I think this is a neat photo is that it's so emblematic of the guys that played in the 60s. You can talk to a few who kind of put it behind them, but a lot of these ball players, it just means so much to them to hang on to those memories and to talk about them. And Stan Williams, you can tell, very much like that. Unfortunately, we lost Stan a couple years ago. He was one of a number of players who passed away, between when I interviewed him and when the book came out, unfortunately. Bill Fall, 1965, he threw 3 shutouts for the Cubs, but there's some really wild stories about this dude. They're in the book. I see a couple people snickering that, yeah, hypnosis, right? I mean, the whole thing. So you'll enjoy those stories if you read the book. Smokey Burgess, I was interviewed on a radio show by Pat Williams, who is the general manager who put together the Philadelphia 76ers championship team. Sadly, he passed away like 2 weeks after the interview. But it was on his radio show. He told me that Smokey Burgess, when he was growing up, was his favorite ball player. This guy was a 295 lifetime hitter, stood 5'8". He started out at 185 pounds. By the end of his career, he was over 200. He never really got into peak shape. He never needed to. I mean, the guy could just hit, and he didn't strike out much. He was a catcher. By the time he got to the White Sox at the end of his career, he played till he was 40. He was pretty much just a pinch hitter at that point. One story that's not in the book, but it's kind of a fun story about Smokey Burgess. He bought his first car and he was living in a small town. He went over to the JCPenney store where there were a lot of young girls, girls meaning, 18, 19, 20-year-old women. And he went there, he wanted to show off his car. Well, 3 or 4 of the women that were working there said, yeah, we'd love to go for a ride. The supervisor, who was like maybe 25 years old, she said, no, I'm sorry, girls, you got to stay here and work. Well, the 25-year-old woman went for the ride and she wound up becoming Smokey's wife a few months later. Eddie Fisher, this is a guy I threw in the deck mainly because he was a knuckleball pitcher and because he had a couple of great seasons with the White Sox here in the Chicago area. 1965, he actually pitched enough innings to qualify for the ERA title, and I think he came in 2nd or 3rd. But you did have more knuckleball pitchers back in the 60s, and boy, the White Sox had some great bullpens. As soon as the White Sox no longer had that really great bullpen in, what was 69, I guess, 68 or 69, when things started to go south, then their fortunes went down. But, when you had Eddie Fisher and you had Hoyt Wilhelm and Bob Locker in your bullpen, and one year Don Massey was really throwing really well, that was like today's bullpens, really a great bullpen. So Glenn Beckert went to college. He was a political science major. It was a really good choice for him because he was a natural politician. He knew how to work a room. He even on the airplanes when the teams were flying, he would be up walking up and down the aisles, talking to people. It was just, he had an irrepressible personality. Second baseman, of course. He started out as a shortstop in the Cubs organization, but after the tragic airplane accidents. Good point. That's where he started. Yeah. And then after Ken Hubbs was killed, there was a necessity for a second baseman, so Glenn moved over to second base. Billy Williams said that Beckert would borrow his cigarettes, borrow his lighter, and you'd be lucky if you ever even got him back. That was just kind of Glenn Beckert. He had a great sense of humor too. Beckert in 65 at the winter banquet when Leo DeRocher was being introduced as the new manager. Glenn Beckert was also on the dais, and part of his remarks, Glenn said, well, it's very unusual for a 240 hitter to be here on the dais, but Mr. DeRocher is here too, so I'm in good company. Where can you find the book? I got like 4 more copies here if anybody would like to pick one up. Otherwise, Amazon, it's also available through the Barnes & Noble website. I've got a buddy who, for the life of him, will not do business with Amazon. He found it on Walmart.com and bought it through them. It's available both as a Kindle ebook and as a paperback. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity to spend time with my brothers, and I was going to say sisters, but I think it's just brothers today from SABR. Looks like we've got maybe 10 minutes, and I'd love to hear some of your memories or if anyone has any questions. Yes, Bob.
Since the Yankees were so good early in the 60s, but they were the dynasty was kind of going down. You interviewed many of those Yankee players from the early 60s, and in fact, you get from them about the team's direction.
Yeah, the folks I interviewed were not too many of them were Yankees. Stan Williams was one who was part of that team for a while. And what he pointed to is that in baseball, a lot of times you'll see everything go right, and then you'll see everything go wrong. And he said for the Yankees, because they had the great trades, bringing in people like Roger Maris, and the talent that they had carrying over from the 50s, everything was going right. And then by the time you got to 64 and beyond, except for a couple of young pitchers coming up, Stottlemyre and Fritz Peterson, and then in 68, Stan Bonson, everything started going wrong. Injuries, players like Jim Bouton inexplicably going from winning 18 a year, to winning 18 over 4 years. Yeah. Yeah.
Just a comment. And extraordinary was Bob Webb.
No kidding.
And he wasn't on the list, so I mentioned that.
Yeah. What do you remember? What do you remember about him?
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
What we remember was against more.
Right. Yeah. It's amazing when you talk to baseball fans about the connections they may have to a player from when they were growing up too. I grew up in a suburb called Rocky River, Ohio, and Herb Score, the former pitcher and later broadcaster, lived 2 blocks away. So, we would see Herb, running. He would stay in shape by running. Got to know him. When my mom passed away, he and his wife sent a real nice sympathy card. And I bet some of you also, encountered players either getting their autographs or knowing them through family members. You had a question or a comment?
Yeah, something about the pitching.
Yeah.
Did the players of the 60s, in your interviews, talk about the prevalence of the slider or slider-related pitches they have these days compared to the 60s?
Yeah, so the slider was considered a very controversial pitch in the 60s because a lot of the pitching coaches thought it was more likely to cause an injury. Now, looking back, I think the screwball maybe, actually caused more injuries, but the A's had a guy named Bill Posadel, who was their pitching coach. He actually forbid, except for Catfish Hunter, he forbid the rest of his pitchers from even throwing the slider. So it was interesting. I did ask a lot of the pitchers and catchers whether the managers were calling pitches from the dugout or whether they had, the ability to call the pitches. And except for Sam McDowell, who to this day is very bitter about Bertie Tebbins calling the pitches, and as he says, calling it like it was the dark ages, fastball, 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 you know. But most of the time it was not managers calling pitches from the dugout. Yeah, sliders were becoming more common, and Ted Williams and Stan Musial both said that they thought the slider was why batting averages were going down in the 60s. Yeah, great thought. John.
So as far as players get to talk to those players, like maybe childhood hero.
Yeah, I did. That actually, especially for the first book, Portrait of a Franchise, that was a real opportunity. That may be, you know, subliminally, that may be one of the reasons I wrote the book, just so I had an excuse to call these guys and talk to them, in some cases to meet them personally for interviews. And they gave great interviews. I'll be honest with you, I can only think of one ball player who was rude. And I mean, even he didn't hang up on me. It was pretty close to hanging up on me. You know, there's no reason to mention his name. But yeah, it was neat to talk to, you know, boyhood heroes. At the same time, you know, when you're writing, you want to be a journalist and present something from the standpoint of a journalist. So I try to have a balance in both books. Yeah.
What was the biggest I didn't know?
Yeah. So the question was, what was the biggest surprise or the biggest I didn't know? It shouldn't have been a surprise, but for me, it was just how much so many of these ball players feel that the game was played so much better in their era. And it wasn't so much because of just the fundamentals, but also just like Steve Blass of the Pirates said, look, you know, the best team is really decided during the regular season, and then you go to the World Series. He said that's what's important. Guys just liked it back then when you didn't have these multiple rounds of playoffs that you have now, where it tends to be more of the team that's hot, you know. The first time we really saw that come into play was 1973 when the Mets won their division with only 83 wins and then, you know, went to the World Series. That's probably the biggest surprise. The other thing, a lot of the players talked to me about the cortisone shots that they had to take. And I didn't realize just how much of a health burden that could be, and even a psychological burden. Jim Lonborg said he had dozens of them, and he said as long as the shot went into the right place, you know, it was smooth and it gave pain relief, but that, you know, occasionally they would put it in the wrong place. Joe Moeller, who was a real hard thrower, but he had arm trouble from an early age with the Dodgers. He said, you know, between not knowing if I had a job each year when I went to spring training and having to take all those shots, and then of course, you know, marital problems, it just wasn't an easy life for a lot of the ball players. And back in those days, a lot of the players would get married early, and it could be hell on the marriages as well. Yeah. Time for a couple more.
Yeah, something about the spitball. You know, Dick Donovan was one of the people talking about. The White Sox, Ray Garris was the coach there.
Yeah.
What did the players have to say about encouraging the spitball?
So most of them will joke about it and laugh about it these days. Phil Regan was a pitcher who spent some time with the Cubs and other teams. At the time, Phil had really mixed feelings about it because he didn't mind initially having a reputation as a guy who maybe was throwing some counterfeit stuff, but then his kids started getting ribbed at school about dad's a cheater, your dad's cheating. And suddenly he was like, you know, this actually is hitting home with my family. But yeah, it was, you know, I mean, Billy Martin would tell his team to try to get away with it. Gaylord Perry, A lot of the guys knew how to do it. Yeah, one question here and then another one with Bob.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Wondering if that kind of a commonplace thing back then, maybe so.
So it really depended on the market. Back in the 40s and 50s, a lot of the Yankees would live within walking distance to Yankee Stadium. But as the neighborhood became much more dangerous, Horace Clark, we believe, is the last fella who did that, you know, in the 60s. Stan Williams, who we've talked about a couple of times here, Stan would live during the season at a hotel in Cleveland. He would make the walk. And even though he was 6'5", he wasn't worried somebody was going to jump him, but he was worried about bullets because, I mean, you know, Cleveland was so dangerous downtown during those days. Baltimore seemed to be one of the places, St. Louis to some extent, where the players liked to be there year round. And Chicago to some extent was too. On the other hand, you know, Cleveland, no way. Vern Fuller and Duke Sims, I think, are the only two guys I can think of that actually lived there year round if they weren't native Clevelanders. Bob?
Yeah, I've read a lot of the book, and when I read, each player is covered in about 2 pages. And I thought I knew a lot of these players pretty well, but what I found intriguing was you cover things that happened to some of these players before they got to the major league. Some stories about them in the minor leagues, and then you cover what happened after their careers. And again, I was really surprised by some of the things I read. What are some of the things maybe that you learned about any of the players before they got to the majors that were most memorable to you?
Some of the guys, you know, really had to overcome even greater odds than you would expect. Injuries as a kid or getting burned in a kitchen fire, things like that. A lot of them came out of broken homes, but some of them also had really inspirational experiences. Jim Wynn, some of you probably remember Jimmy Wynn, the outfielder. He grew up in Cincinnati, and he actually would see players going to the ballpark. And he still, you know, to his dying day, he remembered the day that Frank Robinson and Veda Pinson stopped off at the house, picked him up, took him down there to the ballpark, and Frank Robinson gave him a glove. And I mean, from that moment on, Jim Wynn already liked baseball, but from that moment on, he was inspired to do everything he could to become a big league player. And then the drinking, it was a lot of fun for a lot of the ball players. It became a problem for some. Some guys like Gary Geiger, he would use it just because he was terrified of flying. You know, they drank for different reasons. Only in some cases did it become a problem for the players. And then what did they do after baseball? You know, it's just kind of fascinating from a human interest point of view to see, did they stay in baseball? You had a few people like Dick Allen, Richie Allen, that would have liked to have come back to baseball, but never got the opportunity. His brother, Hank Allen, the brothers really liked horses. He wound up being an owner of horses and had a championship horse at Pimlico. So just interesting things that some of these guys did after baseball.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Let's take a 10-minute break. Bill's going to set up our next speaker on Zoom.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
So if you want, share my screen. I've got my PowerPoint, and if you want to see if it can see it there.
All right, can't see it yet.
Let me see if I can. Oops, hold on. think I might have to do something on my end. Hold on. Can you see that?
Let's see, it started. Can't see it quite yet. Double click to enter full screen mode. Oh, there we go. Del Webb, an American success story.
Yeah, so you can see. Yeah, so yeah, that's my, make sure I can change things here. And of course my
Okay, now we got a page of
okay.
pictures.
Yeah.
Back to
All
the
right, so yeah, I can that's my presentation, and then I think we're ready to go. If everybody can, I did notice when Doug was taking questions, when we're all done, I couldn't hear the audience. So if we have any questions when we're all done, someone near the computer may just have to repeat any of the questions so I can hear.
Yeah, I'm at home myself.
Okay.
So probably, I think Bill Perch was using his computer there
Yes.
to show
Yeah.
you. So I'm going to be back in a few minutes.
All right. All right. I'll hang here and just give me a yell when you're, well, I'll hear when Bob or whoever is ready to go. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Brett. Er, Did you hear me, Brett?
Yeah, they wanted to check me in the room there. So
Oh, sorry. Looking good.
how's this, Bill? This work? Sound okay, Bill, in the room there? Everything good in the room? Are we good?
Floor's all yours, Brett.
All right, can everyone hear me back there?
We can
Thumbs
hear
up?
you.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Well, thank you for inviting me today. Great talk, Doug. I'll tell you, a little bit about me and the Del Webb Sun Cities Museum. So my name is Bret McKeand, and I am the current president of the Sun Cities Area Historical Society Board of Trustees. The Historical Society owns and operates the Del Webb Sun Cities Museum. My background is I actually grew up in Illinois, New Lenox. So all those ball players that Doug was mentioning for the 60s, they seem much more familiar to me today than some of today's ball players. And like a lot of kids growing up in New Lenox, Joliet in the 60s, I can still recite the starting lineup for the 69 Cubs, right? All of us can do that. So I moved to Arizona in 1983, and for 40 years worked for the local newspaper here in the Phoenix area. Retired a couple of years ago. Most of that time was spent with the newspaper right in Sun City, Arizona. So the Del Webb Sun Cities Museum celebrates the history of Sun City and Sun City West. And for those of you who don't know, Sun City was the nation, probably the world's very first active adult retirement community. And we'll touch on that in a little bit as well. Now, I know we have a lot of folks here who want to hear about Del Webb, and then I also know we have the baseball folks here. So I've taken my normal Del Webb talk that I present in Sun City to people who live in the Sun Cities, and they know Del Webb is the developer of Sun City. They don't know much else about him. So I've taken that talk and I've really expanded the baseball part of it. So, you'll hear me talk about Del Webb. I'll stop, go into the baseball, and then we'll continue our regularly scheduled program on the Del Webb history. And a lot of the information we have on Del Webb, and at the end of this, I'll kind of give you a tour of the museum and you'll see what it's all about. We're actually located in the very first model home that was constructed when Sun City opened in 1960. But a lot of the information we have about Del Webb comes directly from the Del Webb Company's corporate newsletters. The museum has a complete every single newsletter printed from 1946 on before they sold to Pulte, the Del Webb Corporation. So a lot of what we have comes from those newsletters, and a lot of the photos that I grabbed, especially for the Yankees, came from those newsletters. So maybe some pretty interesting ones that you've never seen. So we'll jump right into this. Also, I want to introduce Linda Borton is on the call. So you'll see her name and you're probably wondering, well, she's not a member of either one of our clubs. Linda is our office manager at the museum. The museum is all volunteers except for Linda. And so you'll see her. Thank you, Linda. She's here to kind of set me straight if I make any mistakes or errors. So just real quickly, again, in Sun City, many of us, we know Del Webb. Let me see if I can move this here. If I get the, yeah, so many of us know Del Webb as the creator of the retirement community that they're living in. But the story of his life and the company that he built really is an American success story. The Del Webb name became synonymous with some of the largest and most successful building projects in all of the United States, from military installations to schools, shopping centers, hospitals, factories, museums, casinos, of course, retirement communities, national parks, whatever. His company was involved in much more than any of us probably really realize. The success is even more amazing when we learn that the man behind it was forced to leave high school after his freshman year in order to help support his family when his father's business nearly went under. So our story begins in 1899 in Fresno, California, with the birth of Delbert Eugene Webb. His mother was the daughter of a German farmer who built one of California's very first irrigation systems. His father was the son of an English evangelist, and he was also a building contractor and also an amateur baseball player. By the time Dell was 10 years old, he knew his way around a building scaffold or an infield with equal ease. He recalled that he couldn't remember not being captain of a team. He was a famous quote we have. He said, when we chose sides for the pickup game, I was always one of the guys who did the choosing. Oops, let me see if I can. By the time he was 13 years old, he was a beanpole, 6 foot 3 inches tall, and weighed only 130 pounds. At that age, he was already the best first baseman in the entire Fresno area. He got paid as much as $2.50 a game by playing on a pickup semi-pro team. His father's 3 sisters tried to steer him into going to Sunday school and church, as they thought baseball was trafficking with the devil. Webb once referred to his aunts as so religious they squeaked. And at age 14, his father's business went bankrupt. And at age 16, Webb had to drop out of high school after his freshman year to help with his father. Webb's father had taught him basic carpentry skills along with the love for baseball. During the week, he worked as a journeyman carpenter. Weekends, he played semi-pro baseball. That's him in the right, standing up in the right. The first question he would often ask when taken on a job was, does this company have a baseball team? If not, he'd move on. And while carpentry supporting him, baseball was his first love. And he, like many other part-time players, eagerly awaited that call from the big leagues. In 1919, he married his childhood sweetheart, Hazel Church, a skilled operating room nurse. It's a mystery as to what Hazel saw in this young carpenter. Perhaps it was his drive to learn, to improve, to succeed. A friend of our museum, Marjorie Johnson, loaned the museum samples of a correspondence course that Del Webb took from a school in Pennsylvania, along with the actual papers he submitted at the end of each section. The course helped him to learn the basics of masonry, roofing, plumbing, and carpentry. He did all that through mail order. And Webb played in so many different leagues and pitched so frequently that he developed a chronically sore arm. And on a fateful day in 1927, it was a turning point for him. He was scheduled to play in an exhibition game for the inmates of San Quentin prison. And those were Del Webb's drinking days. You know, Doug mentioned how some of the players like to drink now and then. Well, Del Webb did too. And he had such a hangover that day that he missed the boat carrying the rest of the team to San Quentin. When Webb finally found a way across the bay, a prisoner helped him find the dressing room. Webb asked for a drink of water, and the prisoner brought him a pitcher and a glass. A few days later, Webb was laid low with a nasty form of typhoid fever. Twice he almost died, and his weight dropped from 204 pounds to 99. He was in bed for 11 weeks, and it was a year before he was able to work again. Whether it was his doctor's advice, tip from a friend, or a desire for a brand new start, Del and his wife Hazel decided to move to Phoenix in the sunny, dry heat of Arizona. The couple brought with them a little more than his tools, his fastball, and a borrowed $100 when they came to Phoenix. And whether his arm began hurting again or simply realized that he couldn't succeed in 2 professions, he decided to give up baseball, at least for now, and channel all his energy into work. He worked a lot of small jobs in the fall and winter of 1928, including hanging doors in the new Westward Ho Hotel, and that's what you're looking at here, which the building still stands in downtown Phoenix. When they were getting ready for the formal opening, the contractor called all the carpenters together, asked for a volunteer to be available during the opening, just in case something needed fixing, but they would need to wear a dark suit. Del Webb had a dark suit and was at the opening mingling with all the bankers, politicians, and leaders of Phoenix. It was that night that Del Webb met A.J. Bayless, owner of Bayless Markets. A.J. had a store under construction right here in Phoenix, but the contractor had run off with the payroll and disappeared. He didn't have anyone to replace him, and he asked Del Webb if he'd be interested in finishing the job. Bayless was in a race to complete the store before a competitor completed his store nearby, and Del Webb put men to work around the clock and finished this store that you're looking at, a grocery store, in 27 days. Bayless gave him all the equipment the contractor had left behind, and that was the beginning of the Del Webb Construction Company. Despite the depression, the growth of Phoenix offered many construction opportunities for the new company. By 1935, Del Webb needed a larger office with a yard to store material and equipment. He also needed some permanent office employees in addition to the workers he had hired for the job. His wife was working as a secretary, purchasing agent, payroll clerk, and more. And it was more than she could handle. So he soon hired two women for the office and a young man he met at a contractor association meeting. There you go. That young man was Robert Johnson, shown there on the right. Bob Johnson began his career with Webb as a timekeeper, and a year later was sent to Flagstaff to oversee construction of a dormitory, which still stands on the Northern Arizona University campus. 2 years later, Del Webb sent him to LA to open a West Coast office. Bob Johnson went on to become president of the company in the 60s, chief operating officer in 1973, and chairman of the board following Del Webb's death. And when he retired, he headed the Del E. Webb Foundation. One of the more unusual jobs in the 30s that the company built was a white pyramid that still sits on a hill overlooking the zoo in Phoenix. If you're ever in Phoenix and you're driving on the 202, you'll see this little pyramid. It was the tomb of Arizona's first governor, George P. Hunt, who was alive at the time. And Del Webb always claimed the governor visited the gravesite often to check on the progress. That connection may have led to Del Webb building work at the state capitol, Arizona State Capitol here in Phoenix, first an addition and then remodeling and repairs to the old building. At age 34, Del Webb discovered golf. He joined the Phoenix Country Club and was one of the founders of the Phoenix Open, which is today the Phoenix Waste Management Open that you probably see every February. He was a natural athlete and soon won a Pro-Am tournament and won. He not only outscored all the amateurs, but he also outscored the golfing great Byron Nelson. Webb had a favorite caddy, a young man who was on his high school's golf team, had a good was a good golfer in his own right. Webb took a liking to the young man, and when he graduated, the young man went to World War II. Webb told him when he comes back, look him up, he'd have a job for him, and that man was John Meeker, who also went on to his whole career with the Del Webb Company and was the one responsible for overseeing the construction of Sun City and Sun City West. And you're going to see this trend continue, that Del Webb surrounded himself with really good people. He ran his business like a baseball team and talented people. He knew what positions to put them in, and he was loyal to all of them. World War II brought new opportunities as Congress allotted billions of dollars for defense activity. And Del Webb took advantage of those contracts. This shown here is the Sleepy Cavalry Post of Fort Huachuca here in Arizona. In the past, it protected ranchers and miners from unfriendly Apaches, but now it awoke to a new crisis during World War II. Webb was called to Cochise County and here in Arizona to take on 2 projects for the U.S. Army. While his company had grown steadily, the size of the government contracts was really daunting. But he took them on, and he started 10 buildings in July of 1940 and another 36 by the year end. And certainly by the end of 1940, the Del Webb Construction Company was off and running and literally making millions of dollars in defense contracts. At the same time, federal officials decided that the Salt River Valley here in Phoenix, with its clear air and broad vistas, would be an ideal training site for pilots. A ring of facilities sprang up training Americans as well as Chinese aviators and British pilots. 6 training facilities were planned, and the Del Webb Company would be involved in every single one of them. In March 1941, Del Webb began work on the Litchfield Airport, later named the Phoenix Military Airport, and finally, Luke Air Force Base, named in honor of Arizona's very first World War I hero, Frank Luke. And again, if you've been out here to the West Valley, to Sun City, or even to Phoenix, you're probably pretty familiar with Luke Air Force Base. The Luke Air Force Base was every single building built on that base was built by the Del Webb Corporation. So the immense volume of building activity brought out Webb's unparalleled organizational ability, and you're going to hear a lot about this. While many construction crews operated out of tar paper shacks, Del Webb built portable office buildings at every single job site, and they were identical right down to the color and furniture. The same progress reports hung on the walls of each of his projects, so Webb could walk into any job site and instantly check the status of a project. They called this Webb's Blue Book. It told the basics of operation, how to rent equipment, how to write a contract, even specified the kind of desk calendar pads that were to be used. Memo sheets had, quote, put it in writing across the top. This was franchising before franchising was a thing. Bob Johnson referred to the standardization process as Webberization. It was not a uniformity that stifled creativity, but it was a framework that made working easier and much more efficient. Daily reports were required from all construction sites, as Del Webb believed they showed the boss was interested. They kept track of progress and provided a permanent record for future reference. These were an outgrowth of his father's business failure. Del Webb once said that if he went bankrupt, he'd damn sure know why. The daily reports also were in place the years Del Webb owned the Yankees. Also, just to show you how meticulous he was, Del Webb preferred Ford cars, black cars with no AC. It would take years for his employees to persuade him that white cars were much cooler, especially here in Arizona, and many, many more years before they even got them air conditioned. There's a story one time of one employee who drove a tan car to work when Webb wanted all the company cars to be black, and only to find his sedan had been removed from the parking lot and repainted black while he was working. So World War II impact on Del Webb and the company. World War II was to make two major changes in Webb's life. At one point, he was laid up with something the Army diagnosed as the flu, and a doctor was routinely taking his personal history. As Webb told it, when I told him I drank from 10 to 20 bourbons a day, he damn well near dropped his teeth. The doctor said I ought to cut down, but I told him I will quit entirely, and he did that. He never had another drop of whiskey the rest of his life, but he did find that the time he spent drinking could now be devoted to work. One other change was in his signature as a result of signing so many government contracts and forms. Webb told of once getting a call from a banker who wanted to double check the signature on a large check that came from the Del Webb Corporation. And Del Webb's response was, if you can read the signature, it isn't mine. So during World War II, excuse me, Webb's company received $100 million in government contracts and employed 25,000 people. As the war ended, Del Webb had to shift his focus and begin thinking about the future of his company. Luckily, the government showed no signs of shrinking as the Cold War and the needs of veterans demanded action from Washington. Best of all, after all these years without doing, America was ready to expand. Millions would demand new housing. New factories would be needed to produce consumer goods. With nearly every family having a car and leisure time to drive it, shopping, recreational patterns would change dramatically after the war, and Del Webb was going to be part of that in a big, big, big way. All right, now we shift gears here for the baseball fans in the audience. He realized that construction was very cyclical, and so he wanted to diversify both personally and for the business. The most glamorous and showy of all of Webb's personal investments, of course, was to become co-owner of a Major League Baseball team. And while he had sworn off playing baseball, it was still in his blood. He began investigating while busy with wartime construction. The first offer to come his way was the minor league team, the Oakland Oaks, that he could have had for $60,000 in the 40s, but he was too busy and he passed on the offer. In 1945, Dan Topping, who was actually an Army buddy of Del Webb's, I'm sorry, an Army captain that Del Webb had met while building a building base. He called Del Webb to let him know that the Yankees were for sale. He, Larry McPhail, future baseball commissioner, and Del Webb could buy the team for $2.8 million. And you're going to hear me talk about how he brought the rules of business to baseball and was one of the very first people to actually do that. So 2 years later, Topping and Webb bought out McPhail. So they were the two that owned the Yankees. They owned the Yankees for 20 years. And during that time, they put together just an incredible, successful streak of championships, probably the best ever seen in any professional sport. 15 divisional titles, 10 World Series. Some of the greatest names in baseball got their checks signed by Del Webb. He and Dan sold the Yankees 20 years later to CBS for $14 million, so pretty nice profit. And just to kind of put it in perspective, when they bought the Yankees, they bought the stadium, they bought the team, they bought the ground underneath the stadium, and also the spring training site in Florida. But just to kind of put things in perspective, I believe it was in 2017, 2018, the new Yankee Stadium was built somewhere around there, and that cost $1.5 billion. So we're going to kind of just roll through some photos here. We're going to just take you through a tour. And again, a lot of these photos may have been printed in, I was talking to Bob about Sporting News, because they would take a lot of information from Sporting News and put it in their company newsletter, which was called the Webb Spinner. And so I've tried to take out some photos. And again, the Del Webb Corporation, they recorded everything, which was so great. I mean, they had photographers, every single project they built in the country and throughout the world, they documented everything. So here we go, a couple of really great players. The photo on the left is Del with Joe DiMaggio during Joe's final year in baseball. On the right, of course, is a young Mickey Mantle during his very first year. And the boss is either welcoming Mickey or saying something nice to him. Some great photos. He loved Casey Stengel until he didn't love Casey. And dumped him towards the end of Casey's career as a Yankee manager. The photo on the left is, and you'll see in a couple minutes, he brought the Yankees to Phoenix for 1 year for spring training. And this is him trying to get Casey to put on a cowboy hat. Upper right, Billy Martin. Del Webb did not like Billy Martin. And I read a biography, it might have been an autobiography of Billy's many years ago. And Billy blamed Del Webb for his trade. He loved being a Yankee. Billy, as people know, Billy just loved the Yankees. Broke his heart when he was traded, but it was after that incident, I think at the Copacabana, where a lot of Yankee players, including Mickey Mantle, were involved in a fight. Del Webb blamed Billy Martin and shipped him out the next day. Bottom photo is Don Larson after his perfect game in the World Series. Again, with Casey and Dan Topping and Del Webb. The bottom photo I just love because you barely ever see Casey Stengel without his uniform on. He's so recognizable as a manager with his uniform in street clothes. You don't even recognize him very much. On the right was, we have this in the museum. I believe this may have come from the Sporting News, but he reprinted it in his company newsletter. But we have a copy of this hanging in our museum. Again, a couple of, traditions, throwing out the first pitch on opening day. Ike Eisenhower threw out one. They were playing the Washington, the Senators. Yeah, of course. The Senators, and that's Del Webb right behind Ike's throwing arm. Bottom one is Del Webb behind JFK throwing out the first pitch. This is an interesting photo that I'd never seen, but, out there, Memorial Garden there, they dedicated the plaque for Babe Ruth in 1949. And standing next to, so you see Del Webb holding his hat, he's the tallest one there. And a few people down from there is the governor of New York at the time, Thomas Dewey, who ran for president twice, never won. And then next to Tom Dewey is Babe Ruth's wife. The lady up front at the microphone is just singing the national anthem or something. So yeah, operating baseball, he brought a lot of things to the game that other other owners emulated. They really appreciated what Del Webb had done because he turned it into a business. Up until his arrival, baseball, it was a game, sort of a rich man's hobby, but Webb organized things so he knew how much the patrons spent on beer, popcorn, ice cream, sundries. He became very respected by the other owners, and they gradually began to adopt a lot of his same business-like principles I mean, he looked at everything. He had daily reports sent to him on the P&Ls for the New York Yankees. Another interesting thing that he had done, and this is, again, is from his company newsletter, he did respect the players. He wanted them to know that when they were playing for the Yankees, they had it better than any other ball player. And he was the very first one to actually create luxurious locker rooms where every player had their own locker with their name above it. And of course, now that's standard in baseball. 1950, the iconic billboard that I think you see in all those great photos of the World Series from the 50s. That was done in 1950 while he owned the team, cost $100,000. And Del Webb often claimed that much of his commercial success came from applying the rules of baseball to business. He wanted to be bold, he wanted to have a sense of showmanship, be calm in a crisis, and always emphasize teamwork. Little interesting tidbit that not a lot of people know. He did own the spring training site in Florida. And Yankees, of course, everyone knows they train in Florida. But in one year, 1951, he swapped with the New York Giants. Giants went to Florida, and the Yankees trained right here in Phoenix. Phoenix Municipal Stadium, which still stands. His company had built that and did a lot of renovations for spring training. But again, it's the Phoenix Giants played there for spring training. Their AAA team played there all the way up until we got our own professional team, the Diamondbacks. Photo on the right is George Weiss, who was the Yankees GM, Del Webb, and Chet Murphy, who was the general manager of the Phoenix Senators, which was the AAA team for the Senators, and they're looking at how to upgrade Phoenix Municipal Stadium. And that was just for 1 year. I have a autobiography of Yogi Berra, and he claims that Del brought the team to Phoenix for that year just to impress his Arizona friends. Some great photos that I thought you guys might enjoy, especially the one on top. That's Bill Veeck to the right, and we all know him as owner of the White Sox during the 70s. And down below, I think that's Mel Ott, was the manager of the New York Giants at the time. And then up in the upper right is really interesting. That's Ty Cobb. Del Webb, Ty Cobb visited spring training that year in 1951. Del Webb claimed to never liked Ty Cobb. And if you look at that photo, I don't think Del is too happy to be shaking Ty Cobb's hands, but we'll never really know. But I thought that was a great photo. Webb Company holiday party in 1950. Del Webb always had a great company party at the end of the year, and this was one where all the employees dressed up as Yankees and celebrated, no doubt, a World Series. Great photo on the bottom left here. This is the best of the best in 1950. Casey Stengel was manager of the year. Del Webb was executive of the year, and this might have been a sporting news event. I'm not really sure. In the middle there is Sam Snead, golfer of the year, and on the right is Bud Wilkinson, was the football coach of the year, and I believe he was Oklahoma. Del Webb's ownership didn't hurt his business at all. In fact, almost all of Major League Baseball, whenever they needed any work throughout the league, of course, they would call on Del Webb, and it certainly benefited his construction company. They also, when the A's moved from Philadelphia to Kansas City, it was Del Webb Corporation. They didn't build this stadium from scratch. They had I think a minor league stadium or whatever, but they built it into a major league stadium in record time. So when the Kansas City A's opened up their season in, I think what it was, in 1948, it was ready. And on that day, they also, that's Del Webb standing to the right behind the plaque, and that's they honored Connie Mack. I'm sure it was a way to bring that baseball loyalty to Kansas City after so many years in Philadelphia. Also, his company prepared the Coliseum for the LA Dodgers when the Dodgers moved out west. They played for a few years in the Coliseum. An incredible conversion. As you can see here, you can see the dimensions, and you can see why the Dodgers had so many. I mean, they loaded up with right-handed batters because that was 250 feet. I mean, that was that was not, that was a pretty short porch. Center field was a little bit different, but so there's what the dimensions were. And on the bottom right is the Del Webb Corporation actually preparing the Coliseum. And on the left is Del Webb doing some of the work. I don't think he did a lot of it. I'm sure he just did it for this photo, but because most people don't dig in their ties. You know, and the baseball fans in the room know, of course, in 1959, the World Series, that's where the White Sox, the Dodgers and the White Sox played. The Dodgers came out on top, didn't they? Yeah, of course, I should know that. And also, if you're a baseball fan, you can tell this stadium on the left, his company built, and you know what stadium that is, the Anaheim Stadium. When the Angels became a franchise, they built the stadium. It's still there, and that is the Big A. If you've ever seen the stadium or even driven by it in California, you can't miss the Big A, Anaheim Stadium for the Angels. On the right is a minor league field in Modesto, California that they renamed the Del Webb field. It was a field where Del Webb had actually played many times there as a minor league ball player, and then years later they renamed it. And for the opening ceremonies of that, that's Del Webb taking a crack and got a base hit. All right, so now we go back to our regular scheduled program of the company. So Del Webb had his finger in many pies throughout the 40s and 50s. When a contractor defaulted on the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, the bank turned to Webb to complete the job. And this introduced Del Webb to a famous character named Bugsy Siegel, and also it introduced his company to the hospitality industry. Del Webb claimed that Bugsy paid up faster than anybody he had ever worked for, and he always paid up in cash. Webb used to tell the story of meeting Bugsy one time when the gangster kind of was flourishing a gun and casually mentioned that he'd killed a dozen men. Del Webb's eyes, popped wide open, and Bugsy told him, "Don't worry, we only kill each other." A few weeks after the Flamingo opened, Bugsy Siegel was actually shot and killed in Beverly Hills. So Del Webb's encounter with Bugsy Siegel and the gangster element made him a little wary about entering the Las Vegas market. 6 years later, the city was booming and construction opportunities were enormous. So he actually called on J. Edgar Hoover, who was a friend of his, and Hoover encouraged him to return to Nevada and put his name into the building owning casinos, because they wanted to clean up Nevada and Las Vegas, and they wanted respected businessmen to come on in. So that's how he entered the gaming business, and he ended up owning several casinos throughout the 50s and 60s in Las Vegas. So Sahara was his. He was the first one to build a huge convention casino hotel. Some of the casinos he owned right there, you probably are familiar with some of those. Just real quickly, I don't want to go too much longer with this, but so he was a very unique individual. He had three hotel suites throughout the country, and he had a complete wardrobe, matching wardrobe, and the golf clubs in each one. I want to get moving pretty quick. So he built hospitals, schools, stores, apartments, shopping centers throughout the country. He built his very first residential community. It was for a mining company in San Manuel, Arizona, Pueblo Gardens it was called. And that was the very first time he ever built a complete community. By that, I mean, it was so far away from the desert. It had homes, schools, roads, shopping centers. Everything was there for them. And that served as the model a few years later when he decided to build Sun City. And how that came about is, if any of you remember the old Today Show with Dave Garroway in the morning, they did a segment on Youngtown, which was a retirement community in Arizona, but just a community for retirees. There were no recreation centers or anything. Del Webb decided, you know what, we're gonna get out there, we're gonna do that. Most of his company officials said that's not gonna work. People aren't gonna, retirees aren't gonna, you're gonna build a community, more people are gonna die than move in. But he was insistent. They did surveys, found out that most retirees had moved into different communities throughout the country, California and Florida. They were upset because the builder never came through with their promises of what they were going to build. So his idea was, we're going to build a community that's going to be self-sufficient. Everything's going to be there the day that people buy their homes. And that's what he did. So this was Sun City, Arizona. The top right photo was in July of 1959. They started building the community to open up on January 1st, 1960, only 5 months later. What you can see in this picture is Sun City being built, the golf course, 5 model homes. Our museum's in the very first model home there. That's Grand Avenue, if you've ever been to Phoenix, to the top right. Top right, little town in there is Marinette, which was the town that was there before Sun City. It was still, a little bit of it was still there when they were building Sun City. They didn't think it was going to be successful, but on January 1st, 1960, it was January 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, a weekend, holiday weekend, 100,000 people showed up. They sold all 237 parcels of land. It was a complete success, a couple $1 million worth of property. When it opened, again, what Del Webb wanted to do, and it hadn't been done up to that point at all, was you bought into an entire community. So you see a shopping center there. You see the cars backed up 2 miles to a town called Peoria. You see the 5 model homes. You see a recreation center, fully functional. You see a golf course you could use on that day, restaurant, hotel, so that you didn't have to worry about anything not being there a couple of years from now. So it was a success from the very get-go. Got himself a Time magazine cover, not because of the Yankees, not because of casinos, but because of a retirement community that he built. He also was, again, a big sports fan. I always like to throw these in there. He sponsored an Indy car. Roger Ward drove the Sun City Special in 1961, finished in 3rd place. Also had a NASCAR to help promote Sun City. Back to baseball real quickly. He loved baseball. As Sun City grew in the 1974, he built a professional baseball stadium in Sun City, which served for 10 years as home to the Milwaukee Brewers. And you'll see in the left-hand corner there, Hank Aaron. Many of you know he went back to Milwaukee for his final year in baseball. So his final spring training year was in Sun City. Beautiful stadium. Again, lasted 10 years. Once the Del Webb Corporation left Sun City, there was, Sun City is still unincorporated. So they had to tear the state. They sold the property, tore the stadium down. But we had some great ball players. Rod Carew, I took that photo. Raleigh Fingers, I took that photo as a reporter way back then. Before they tore the stadium down, they had a short-lived senior professional baseball league. We had the Sun City Rays, Fergie Jenkins, Raleigh Fingers. It only lasted about 2 months. They ran out of business, or money, I should say, and it didn't. But it was a good concept. So I'll just breeze through the rest of this real quick. He was a personal friend of Howard Hughes. Allegedly, Howard Hughes would take Del Webb's calls, and he would call Del Webb a lot. And almost all the buildings and properties that Howard Hughes built, he used Del Webb. Some of the other things that he had done, he built all the missile Titan and Minuteman missile silos for the government in the 50s and 60s. That was the Del Webb Corporation. He built a lot of projects there at the the World's Fair in New York City in 1964. His company built Madison Square Garden, or rebuilt it, I should say, while they were still running trains underneath. Beverly Hilton, many of you might be familiar with that hotel. That was his company. Built that. Highway House was a string of restaurants and hotels throughout the Southwest in the 50s and 60s. He was a friend to celebrities. If you go to Sun City, you'll drive on Hope Drive, Crosby Drive, Sneed Drive, Palmer Drive. They're all named at Welk Drive, all named after his friends. That's Bob Hope, and that's Lawrence Welk down below. Again, Jack Benny, Lyndon Johnson, Chichi Rodriguez. The top right was that's Governor John Connally of Texas. Del Webb built the space space centers in Texas. And these are just some photos from Sun City. He did come out to Sun City quite a bit. We have, when you go into the museum, we have a recording of Del Webb talking about his legacy. And to him, his legacy of all the things he did, his legacy, he says, was Sun City. People changing the lives of people that retired. This is a photo of him with Jack Nicklaus. I threw this photo in there because on the right is his second wife, Tony. His first wife, Hazel, they got divorced. He built a home for her in Sun City. Real generous Del Webb. And this is his second wife. She was much younger than Hazel. Neither wife, they didn't have any kids. He took good care of himself. However, in 1974, he was hospitalized for prostate cancer. They told him he could, live a healthy life, but he died a couple months after that initial prognosis. He died 50 years ago this year, July 4th, 1974. The entire web spinner was devoted to his death that month. And we have a display of this. I wouldn't call it a celebration, but we commemorated it this year, July 4th. The museum was open and we shared some information. So anyway, the company, lived for a few more, or about, I think, 20 years afterwards, because again, he had built it like a baseball team. He had put really good people in positions, and the business continued to grow and flourish until about the 1990s. The management then, they were just overextended, and they eventually sold to Pulte Corporation. And Bob, I don't know if your community was built by the original Del Webb Corporation or if that was built by the Pulte folks. We still celebrate Del Webb here in Sun City. There's a hospital named after him. Incredibly, the groundbreaking of that in, I believe that was in the 80s. I covered that as a reporter, and Mickey Mantle came out for so he was still connected with the Del Webb name in some way or fashion. But so we have a hospital named after him. We have a statue of him in Sun City. Again, he's really revered in Sun City and Sun City West. And there's our museum and the very first model home. It's called the Del Webb Sun City Museum. We do get funding from the Del Webb Foundation. When you walk into the museum, you see Del standing there, and there's a little button. Push that button and you'll hear what I just mentioned. He was on the Merv Griffith show. You remember the Merv Griffin a couple of months before he died. And it was a special edition of Merv Griffin where he brought on 4 or 5 of the nation's millionaires. They were talking about their companies. And when asked about, Del, you did all these great things in your life. What are you most proud of? He said Sun City. And when you push that button, it's just great. He says, I come out to Sun City. These people come up and they give me a hug and they tell me how much Sun City changed their lives. And so we're real proud of that. This is the Del Webb room. We have one of the bedrooms devoted to Del Webb. We tell his life story. We have the largest collection of Del Webb's personal items. Again, he had no kids, so we have most of it. We have a collection of baseball bats signed by those many great players that played for him in the 50s. Just memorabilia from Del Webb, and we have a complete list. In the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see on that top of that case is a book that lists every single project, building project, community, whatever, hotel, hospital, whatever his company built. We have a complete list of every project, and it's categorized by states and by countries. He was a meticulous note taker, so we have his diaries were all donated to us. And one of the funny diaries we had was the day that he got married for the second time, all business. It says, meeting at 8 o'clock, meeting at 9 o'clock, got married at 10 o'clock, had a luncheon meeting at 11 o'clock. I mean, it was just like another thing he had done that day. So that's it. I probably went a little bit too long, but if you're more interested, we do have a book that was published by the Del Webb Corporation a few years back. That's available at our website, and also the history of Sun City with a lot of great photos and some more information about Del Webb. Both those books are available on our website. I'm proud to say that I wrote the one on the left. So there you go. That's the museum, our website, QR code. the museum website is just fantastic. We have a lot of information about Del Webb there, thousands and thousands of photos on Sun City West, and we have a lot of the Del Webb company photos, but we do have a complete collection of the Webb spinner. And again, if you want to know, they didn't cover a lot about the Yankees in the Webb spinner because that was company news, and that, the Yankees weren't owned by the company, they were owned by Del Webb, but they couldn't help but put a lot of information about the Yankees in the Webb spinner. For instance, I was telling Bob the other day, in 1957 when they played the Braves in the World Series, they had a great story about how much, at the time, the 1957 World Series was the best attended World Series ever, and it was the highest netting in terms of money. And they were proud to say that the winning Braves players got $8,000 each. The Yankees lost the World Series, but those players each got $5,000, and it was incredible. 1957, $8,000 for winning the World Series. So that's my story. I'm open for some questions. I hope I didn't overstep my time there, Bob.
You're fine. Can you hear me? Brett, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. It was a bit of an echo. I know the very first time when people were asking Doug questions, I couldn't hear them. So if anybody has any questions, they might want to have somebody, maybe Bill next to his computer can repeat the question so I can hear it. I'm not hearing anything right now. Not hearing anything. I'm going to stop share though, if that's okay.
Keep going.
Okay, now I can hear you.
You hear me, Brett?
Yep.
Okay. Anyone have a question for Brett? Yes, I'll relay it.
You mentioned Bill Veck. In Bill Veck's autobiography, he devoted an entire chapter to how much he despised Bill Webb and George Wallace. Do you know what the source of that animosity was?
You might, somebody near the computer might have to repeat that or put it in chat.
About Bill Beck. I didn't know this. Bill Beck wrote a whole chapter in his book. Is that correct? How much he despised Bill Beck. We wonder if you know any more.
Oh, I think you're asking about Bill Veck. I don't know much more than, I obviously know Bill Veck from growing up in Chicago and, Disco Demolition and funny uniforms. But that photo I had didn't explain why he was there in that photo at spring. That was during 1951 during spring training. I don't believe he worked for the Giants, but he may have worked for the Indians at that time, and the Indians trained here in Arizona. So maybe he was just visiting that day, visiting with Del Webb or whatever. But that's all I know about that photo with Bill Veck.
Yeah, I know a little more, and it may be, I haven't seen this book, but the story I've told is when Bill Beck owned the ball with St. Louis Browns in 1953. He wanted to sell the team to people in Baltimore. And Del Webb got wind of who he was selling to. Or, pardon me, he wanted to move the team to Baltimore. He wanted to move the team. He didn't want to sell. He wanted to move it. Del Webb said, look, you've been a really poor owner of the St. Louis Browns. You're financially negligent. We can't have you go to another city, and then you gotta get involved. So he stopped it. And Del Webb arranged for people in Baltimore to buy the Browns. And I don't know if that's why he despised him. Have you read that whole chapter? Does that make any sense? Is that okay? So
It wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me at all because Del Webb really, he was quiet, but he had a lot of pull in baseball. They respected him a lot. In fact, in another one of the books that I had heard that they had asked him after he sold the Yankees if he would be the baseball commissioner, and he didn't want to do it. But I think he would have been a good one compared to, I think at the time we had Bowie Kuhn. But So yeah, he was, I mean, I think even after he left, sold the Yankees, I think he was still very involved and, you know, the owners, uh, he ranked right up there in terms of money and prestige. So they probably still relied on him. A funny thing I did see, and again, going through the web spinner, I just love it. It's just great, his history. He and Dan Topping and Larry McPhail actually purchased a third share in a football team. And I actually had to go back in the NFL records to figure this out. But uh, in 1948, they had bought a third share in the New York, the Bulldogs, which were an NFL team. The New York Giants were a football team, but they had two. And the Bulldogs were an NFL team, not a good one. And then the very next year, they changed the name to the New York Yanks, the Yanks football team. And it only lasted 2 or 3 years and then it was gone. So, but there was an item in the web spinner that they were buying a football team, and nothing ever happened. And again, that team went bankrupt, I think, fairly quick or disappeared.
Any other questions for Brent? Yes. Chad?
If I understood this correctly, that Del Webb not only built casinos, but he actually owned them?
Yes. Yeah, so he started off building them, and then you know, when they wanted to clean up Las Vegas, I guess they had a new governor and some new people, and they said we've got to get rid of the mob. Yeah, you know, everybody knows that story, and so they wanted to bring in legitimate, respected businessmen, and so Del Webb came in, and yeah, at one time he owned at least 4 of that we know of. We found another one, a Del Webb employee, just over the summer. I think passed away, but his wife gave us a bunch of, he was a photographer for the Del Webb Corporation, and she gave us these banker's boxes full of photos that he had taken, and 2 of those were of casinos that he owned that we had never heard of. They weren't in Las Vegas; they were kind of on the state line. So, you know, we're learning new things as well. But yes, he actually owned casinos. I think the most famous was the Mint, because you see a lot of photos of the Mint during the 50s and the 60s. Any Elvis fans in here? If you ever watch Viva Las Vegas, and they have a race at the end of the movie, and they continually use the same scene of the cars going past the Del Webb, the Mint, and you'll see Del Webb's Mint, and it just says Del Webb's Mint, and so that's what I always knew he owned the Mint because of those photos, but he owned quite a few.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, Chad.
But so he owned the casinos at the same time as he owned the Yankees?
No. He I'm not really sure about that. He sold the Yankees in '64. He may have owned the Sahara before that, but he didn't get into owning most of the casinos until after he sold. It was the mid '60s, late '60s. But he may have owned 1 or 2 of them at the same time.
Doug?
Wondering if Del Webb had good relationships with the labor unions, or if he tried to avoid labor unions.
That could take a whole nother talk. We have a lot of funny stories. Yes, he did, but like a lot of, you know, big companies, wealthy companies, you know, he would fight them now and then. But in the 60s, I'm sorry, you know, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, especially the government contracts, you know, he pretty much had his say on. You know, the interesting tidbit, I mentioned this to Bob, is in our museum of all the projects we have, you know, on the wall, one of the projects that he was actually quite proud of before he died, he mentioned that he was proud of this project, but he built the Japanese internment camps in California and Arizona for the government. They came to him and he built those, and never seemed to waver on, he was just doing his patriotic duty. Probably not a proud moment for the company, but he did that. We have some great stories of the labor unions in Arizona while he was building Sun City, but I can, again, save those for another time.
Any other questions for Brett from the room? So I'll tell one story that you can tell me if you can embellish it, Brett, but I want Doug to hear it. When I did my research on Del Webb, and of course I grew up a Cardinal fan. And so in 1964, the Cardinals played the Yankees in the World Series. And that was the last time the Yankees won the pennant for a number of years. And I remember this vividly. The Yankees wanted to fire Yogi Berra late in that season because they weren't doing well. It didn't look like they were going to make the World Series, but they did make it. And they fired Yogi after they lost the World Series in Game 7 to the Cardinals. And then the Cardinal manager, Johnny Keane, who got fired by the Cardinals, he got hired by the Yankees as their new manager. But Dell later said that he had always been against the Yankees bringing Yogi Berra as their manager in 1964, replacing Ralph Howard, because he didn't think Yogi could work with his former teammates immediately as a manager, and Yogi didn't have the qualifications to be a major league manager. So as I understand it, one of the last things he did, Brad, was he actually was part of the firing of Yogi Berra. Because he was there 1 year and he was in the World Series, but Dell had always had regrets about Yogi being named the manager. And then the Yogi Berra story goes on and on after that with Mets and Steinbrenner and him not getting along. So have you heard that story, Brett?
No, but it wouldn't surprise me because again, by the mid 60s, Del Webb's company was huge, and every project they did, it's amazing to read the stories because they documented everything, but everything was done first class. I mean, they really, really, all the hotels and everything that they did, Sun City was done really, really well. He didn't skimp on anything. So it wouldn't surprise me as a owner of a baseball team. I think he had probably signs of a little George Steinbrenner, maybe a nicer George Steinbrenner personality. But I wouldn't surprise me that he would go a couple years with a losing manager. I would think he would probably fire him quickly.
Well, and then the end of the story is a couple years later, after he had sold the Yankees, he and Yogi met up with him, and he told Yogi, because the Yankees were losing after that, they were losing. Oh, Yogi, I regret firing you because everything went downhill after that. So did it, and then he regretted it. Okay, anyone else? Question for Brad? Again, he's president of Del Webb Museum. When I met him, I went on the website. And they have a speaker bureau. And I just sent a message in that we wanted a speaker here. And Brett called me and said, yeah, we do speeches for anyone. And we scheduled this, and I'm planning to visit Brett in March with my wife. We're gonna go to spring training for the Cubs, and we're gonna go to the Del Webb Museum. So it's been great to have you. Let's give Brett a round of applause for that. All right, thanks, Brad. So that concludes our meeting today. I have some of my memorabilia from the 60s, which Doug saw earlier, over here on the counter as you go out, if you want to look at it. And thanks for coming today for this special meeting of Del Webb Skybox Group and of SABR in Chicago. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. And you can take that Time Magazine cover if you want to take that later.